Hello everyone, and welcome back to Controlled Crash. My name is Chris, and if you're just joining me for the first time, my goal is to show that concept art can be for everyone, regardless of skill level. This is going to be a longer form video today, as I'm going to step you through my process for creating environment concepts from beginning to end. This video is also going to serve a second purpose though, as I'm going to be talking about something that I think is really important and rarely discussed in digital painting, and that's the hidden truth about speed painting, so stay tuned. To begin, you'll want to decide on your canvas shape and make a series of boxes with that ratio. Here I'm blocking in 9 widescreen boxes for my compositions, since that's the cinematic shape that I like to work in, and it's the shape of most movie screens. I'm setting my boxes as a mask for my thumbnail group, so that I can paint inside without going over the edges, and filling all the boxes with a neutral gray. For these thumbnails, I'm going to be working almost entirely in just a few values. Value being the term for how light or dark a color is. Limiting the values to just a few helps me to avoid too much fiddly details so I can focus on just big shapes. I'm also using a big blocky brush. I found one great trick for this. It's that when I paint, I tend to even out my shapes by keeping my mark making balanced. By using a brush like this, which is taller than it is wide, or the opposite, one that's wider than it is tall, it forces me to make shapes which are weighted more vertically than horizontally, and I find that helps keep my marks off balance, which is a good thing. You'll see that I'm naturally working with darker shapes toward the foreground and lighter shapes toward the background. This accounts for depth haze, or what painters call atmospheric perspective. What you're seeing is the lightening effect that air has over large distances, and you'll find that adding some depth haze can really increase the scale of an image. Now, note that there are other ways to work: lighter foreground, darker background, or dark, light, dark, light, dark, light, but these are advanced techniques and we won't go into them here. There are a few things I'm doing very intentionally at this point. One is painting with the rule of thirds heavily in mind. The rule of thirds is a compositional standard which says that when you divide an image into 3 parts, both horizontally and vertically, regardless of its ratio, placing areas of interest along or near those lines creates the most dynamic compositions. It tends to create weight of either positive or negative shape, which either pushes or pulls your eye into your focal elements. It also creates an image which is intentionally off balance, which leads to what I consider one of my fundamentals of composition, and that's the principle of impending change. While a stable and centered composition is nice to look at briefly, you'll find that it doesn't keep the viewer entertained for long. Balance has been reached, and the story's over. However, if your piece is intentionally off balance, it leaves the viewer with a growing sense that something is about to happen. The weight of that imbalance is about to push the composition into a new state, and this keeps them bouncing around the image trying to subconsciously stabilize it. This can be a very powerful tool for maintaining engagement and creating images that pull the viewer into the story. Ask yourself, does the viewer want to know what is going to happen next? The other thing I'm doing is using a mixture of big, medium, and small shapes in the foreground and the background. One of the hallmarks of sci-fi concept art is this notion of ridiculous scale. You can often create a compelling image by simply placing a small figure or scale object in front of something to sell a massive or otherworldly scale. That's why scale birds are so useful. It's also good to have that mixture of big, medium, and small shapes to keep the viewer's eye interested. And the contrast between the elements, that is, the difference between their scale or value, lets the big shapes feel bigger and the small shapes feel smaller. That's a good rule of thumb for contrast in general. Think of it as a supercharger for any particular trait. If you want a big object to feel bigger, give it a much smaller object for comparison. If you want an orange object to feel oranger, give it a blue object so we can really see its orangeness. Let its trait stand out. You'll see as I'm working through these thumbnails that I'm loosening up my compositions as I go along. This is something that I've struggled with in the past, feeling like my compositions are stiff, or I found that no amount of thinking and theorizing ahead of time is as powerful as just shaking off that rust that collects between paintings and knocking out a few stiff compositions early on to clear the way for the good ones that I don't think about as much. I've learned not to be too hard on myself and instead kind of to rely on this effect and start to look forward to my middle and later thumbnails because they tend to be simpler, more direct, more bold, and more interesting. That's part of the importance of this thumbnail stage, is it gets some of the obvious ideas out of the way first and forces you to take more risks as you go along. But the nice thing is it's a controlled risk, since these are so low effort and they go so fast that there's very little time invested. You may also notice I'm giving very little information about the ground terrain, just using it as contrasting shapes for my story elements. The goal of each of these is to set a very clear and specific story beat, even if it's just spaceships hanging in place over a planet. The focus of each piece is clear, the subject is easy to see, and the shapes all help to reinforce the importance of the story. This is true even of very simple stories like these. So I've got my 9, and now I think I know which one I want to refine into a finished piece. In the next section, I'll be taking this sketch and expanding on it in color and more detail. Let's go. So now that I have my sketch, I'm going to start a new composition in a larger size and begin my proper painting. Some people will start by blowing up their sketch to a larger size and working right on top of that. In fact, I do that about half the time, but this time I'm just going to eyeball it and recreate the sketch since it's fairly simple. I already know my basic value groups from the thumbnail, so I'm just going to start blocking in color. I'm starting with the background sky layer. I'm working my way forward, adding a new layer or group every time I jump forward so that I can later move my elements around without repainting what's behind them. Using a lasso to make hard shapes for my background mountains is a favorite way to start, and then I can use a slightly toothy brush or one with an interesting shape to help me make more unusual marks, which increases the rate of happy accidents when I paint. I can use a soft brush to block in the sky gradient, and then that same edge brush to begin making some cloud shapes. As I work from large, simple shapes to the smaller ones, you'll notice that I'm still not focusing on detail. Everything is rendered in big, bold, impressionistic shapes without a lot of fine information. I'm just getting the broad story blocked in. This process has a lot of different names, but the most common one is speed painting. Now, speed painting has a lot of different meanings to a lot of different people, so I wanted to give a basic overview because I feel it's something that's not terribly well understood, and I see it can also do a lot of damage if it's not placed in the proper context. Since my passion is to show that concept art is for everybody and to build you up instead of tear you down, this is a great chance to dispel some myths. So first off, speed painting is not painting really fast. There's a lot of painting demos on YouTube that are labeled speed paints, which show a very fast painting of an epic image. I have to be clear on this. These are just sped up paintings. They are regular paintings in Photoshop, most probably taking 1 to 2 hours, that have been sped up 2 to 4 times to shorten the runtime. Okay, so that's myth number 1. Speed paintings are not paintings done quickly, they are painted at regular speed. The piece you're looking at now, it's sped up to 4 times normal speed to make this video digestible. Alright, myth number 2. Speed paintings are examples of an artist creating epic, amazing art with no prep out of thin air. False. This one, more than anything, is one I run into in the comments, and it causes me physical pain because of how much it deflates people's confidence. I watch a lot of speed painting demos, and I read comments like, "Oh my god, I can't even draw a stick figure, and you whip this up out of nowhere in 10 minutes flat. I'll never be this good." Or, "I thought my art was okay, and then I see this masterpiece that you call a sketch, and it makes me want to give up." So, there's a component that's missing when these are being presented that makes them make a lot more sense, and it's context. Most speed paintings you see online are stump speeches. Now, if you're not familiar with the term stump speech, it's a 19th century term for a pre-written, short political rally speech. Before they started holding political rallies in stadiums or other venues, candidates would go from town to town, stand on a sawed-off tree stump, and deliver a canned, short, pre-crafted speech designed to win the vote. And it was the same speech at every stump, in every town, rinse, repeat. What you're seeing when you look at most speed paintings, way more often than not, isn't a beautiful, epic painting created out of thin air with no prep time. Yes, they're beautiful. Yes, they are created on the spot with no specific prep. But, and this is the big one, this is the piece that artist has drawn dozens, if not hundreds of times. This is their stump speech. They may not have done this specific castle overlooking this specific valley before, but I guarantee you they've drawn castles and valleys so many times that they can make one in their sleep. And these are the paintings that people look at and get disheartened because they aren't yet able to do the same. Imagine being in an old-time political rally as an amateur speechwriter, hearing a candidate stand up and give a super punchy 1-minute speech that gets the crowd cheering and thinking, oh man, they wrote that speech on the spot and it was amazing. There's no way I could ever be that good. Remember, same speech, different stump. Think about it. If you were to create a YouTube video of you doing a live painting, would you draw something you'd never drawn before and had no experience with and therefore risked public failure? Or would you do what you were trained at and had tons of experience in? This is the majority of what you're seeing when you look at speed paintings. Stump speech sped up. And when you look at it that way, it's way more achievable than it may have looked before. So, what are speed paintings and how are they used? Well, okay, the term speed painting is really more of an online art community term. Really what these are is low detail colored thumbnails or sketches. In the industry, we would use pieces like these to give a rough idea for a final image before we got approval to move on to the proper painting, possibly submitting 2 or 3 of these at a time. Or we would submit this as a WIP, or work in progress, of a finished piece. The purpose of a speed painting or color sketch at this point in the industry is to deliver the maximum amount of mood, color, feel, tone, and storytelling with the minimum amount of actual painting time. Think of it like the framework of a car with all the extras stripped out. You want to present the bare minimum to get your idea across without wasting time. Once your sketch is approved, you would move on to finer detail and refinement, photo textures, or any structural changes that needed to happen. What you'll see that I've done in this image is use the simplest tools to create the impression of detail without actually adding detail. The terrain only gets a few sparse brush strokes to imply variation over distance. The monuments in the background are simple, repeated basic shapes with only the tiniest notches or greebles added to trick the eye into completing the story of detail at a distance. This is a common speed painting trick, combining big, broad shapes with the tiniest of detail elements to convince the viewer that there's more going on between the two than there actually is. You're implying that mid-level of detail. Another easy trick for this, as with the foreground figure, is painting quick detail with only the slightest value difference. For example, black and very nearly black, or black and slightly darker black. A great way to do this is to paint your details in complete black or white and then knock back the opacity to like 3 or 5%. The detail is there, but your eye barely picks it out and it implies more than it actually shows. The water here is created with a great technique of blocking in the shape with pure white, then pasting a flipped reflection of the entire canvas, copy merged, on top. I have a whole video on that if you want to know more. This phase is what I call the focus check. It's a trick for making sure your painting is doing what it's supposed to be doing. Create a new layer, pick a bright color like yellow on low opacity. Grab a big round hard brush, and now lean back and take in your painting like you're looking at it for the first time. Let your eyes move around the image to areas of interest and mark the biggest 3 or 4 areas where your eye wants to linger. Now, sit back again and look at the marks you've made. Is that where the story is happening in your image? Is that where your viewer is supposed to be looking? If so, great, your painting is firing on all cylinders. If not, I plan on doing a full video in the future to show how to adjust your painting to align your focus circles to your painting's goals. For this piece, I'm at a good stopping point as I've decided that it's doing what I want it to be doing, basically. It tells a story, it has enough detail to imply more without doing more, and I'm at the sort of threshold where I need to decide to either stop or to turn it into a full-fledged painting with another 2 or 3 hours of work. Here I'm throwing in a quick vignette and chromatic aberration to give it a nice finished appearance. I also plan on doing a full video in the future on quick finishing touches to make your paintings look amazing with very little effort. So there we have it, the finished speed painting, or, if you came along with me on this journey, color sketch. Now let's review what we learned. 1, we started with quick black and white thumbnails where we burned through enough ideas to get to a good one, and then turned it into a color piece. 2, in that color piece, we still used big broad shapes and added just enough tiny detail to imply more and tell the story. 3, we stopped on the threshold of turning it into a full-blown painting. And 4, what we saw was a stump speech, a painting that had been done dozens if not hundreds of times and was played back at high speed. So here's what I want you to take away from this. The next time you watch a speed painting and think, I could never do that, instead ask yourself, what would I look like an expert at if I did it 100 times, played it back at high speed, and edited out all my mistakes? Digital painting is, in my experience, 1 part tips and tricks, 1 part good ideas. The ideas can be trained and the tricks can be learned. All right? You got this. So thank you so much for joining me. I wish you the absolute best of painting. And until next time, go make worlds.